we're doing pretty well as far as how far we're getting in lecture. I think the pace that we're going is good, but I think I'm going to actually slow it down just a touch. So we may actually not get to viruses for exam 1, but I'll keep you guys posted every time we meet as to like how far we're getting and what you can expect. We have 2 meetings this week and 1 meeting next week that will all be covering content that will go on the exam, the first exam, which is a week from Wednesday. So basically 4 class periods from now, there's an exam. You guys following what I'm saying? It's all in the syllabus too. You've got a schedule. But remember I said we wouldn't move the test, but we might change the content. So while it says you'll see chapters 18 through 21 on exam 1, if we don't get to viruses, which is 21 completely, then that won't be on the first exam. So just, keep listening up for updates on that. And I'll post it on D2L as well as the time for the test gets closer. So we're still on 18. So this is our, 4th lecture? And we're still working our way through chapter 18 on evolution, which is totally fine because there's a lot to talk about in this chapter. And it's the foundation, basically, of everything that we're doing and learning in this class. So we ended last week, Wednesday, with misconceptions, right? We had a good discussion, I think, about some ideas that are sort of circulating about what evolution is or isn't, and then we talked about sort of how to dispel those misconceptions. So that gets us to a little bit of talk about speciation, which is kind of how we're going to end this chapter, and then the next chapter is still on evolution, but it's on the evolution of populations. So we'll get into a little bit more specifics in that direction in chapter 19. So the rest of 18 is talking about species and sort of how they arise. Where do new species come from? What's the driving force that leads to the diversity that we see across the planet? You guys know the answer. It's the title of the chapter. Evolution, yeah. So remember, that's basically, like I said, the foundation of everything, and that's where we're coming from. So I'm going to talk to you guys in terms of the biological species concept. When you look up species concept, depending upon which source you are looking at, you might see 4 or 5 different definitions of a species concept, or you might see like 15. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion amongst biologists about what constitutes a species. Every species concept has its strengths and its limitations. Okay. The biological species concept is the one that we're going to operate under, and that just says that a species is a group of organisms that naturally interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. What do you guys know does viable mean? What is a viable offspring? Anybody know that word? Yeah.
One that would be capable of living to adulthood.
Yeah, capable of living. So it will be born alive and has the potential to make it to adulthood. That's viable. So non-viable offspring would be if 2 species who have different numbers of chromosomes try to breed and the resulting zygote has an unbalanced number of chromosomes that leads to basically fatality, right, before birth, before development even. So viable means capable of living. And what about fertile? Yeah, capable of reproducing, so have to be able to make more of the same species. So that's basically the biological species concept. Can you guys think of an immediate example of a limitation of this concept? It's up there, so you can peek. Yeah.
Organisms that reproduce asexually.
Yeah. What do you do about organisms that reproduce asexually? How do you qualify asexually reproducing groups as species if they don't interbreed ever? Because it's not part of their biology, right? So that's the major limitation of this concept, but that's okay. All right, so if you go into evolutionary biology or phylogenetics or taxonomy as a career, you can decide how you define a species. For us in intro biology too, we're going with biological species concept, okay? There are others. A good example right off the top of my head, is ecological species concept, which says basically if you compete for the same resources or you share the same ecological niche, you're a species. Well, I feel like that has more limitations than this one, right? Because competition isn't necessarily only within the same organisms. You have this interspecific. There's the phylogenetic species concept, which is totally based on DNA. So every way that you look at it is going to have some sort of little caveat to it or some sort of limitation. And so again, it's up to you in the work that you're doing to decide what defines a species. But for us, biological concept works great. Okay, so if organisms are in a group that could potentially interbreed, produce viable offspring, fertile offspring, same species. Okay, so that's the definition that we are working with. But even with this definition, there are exceptions. So what's a hybrid? You guys know? When two different species successfully reproduce. So that throws the biological species concept out the window in sort of, okay? So an example of this would be a mule. Where does a mule come from? Horse plus donkey, right? Now, when you have mules, do they make more mules? You guys know? No. They don't, right? In fact, sometimes they do, but it's super rare. Since like 500 years ago, when people started keeping records of this type of thing, I think there have been 60 or somewhere around 60 mules having more mules. But that's, not very many, right? So anyway, it happens, but it's not very common because horse and donkey have different chromosome numbers. And it's actually it's so specific that it comes down to whether your horse is a male or female and your donkey is a male or female, because that matters because of chromosome number and the fact that horses and donkeys are also XX, XY like we are. So if you have a female, you have double dosage of some genes, right? You guys kind of remember that from Bio 1. This is not stuff you guys have to know. I'm just kind of telling you some interesting facts about this. To make the point that even if you get hybridizations, these two, horse and donkey, remain separate species because largely their offspring are viable, there it is, but not so much fertile, okay? Another note, so we're going to talk in a little while about how plants can sort of overcome genetic challenges that animals aren't really good at doing. So hybridization usually results in infertile animal offspring, but in plants, they can withstand all kinds of weird genetic modifications. So we see hybridization a lot in plants. So we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail a little bit later. So just kind of note that for now. All right. Another sort of interesting concept to think about is, another species concept is the morphological species concept, which is anatomy based. So if you look at an animal and you say, well, these things look different, so they must be different species, you can be fooled. And the inverse is also true. So if we look at these, what are these? You guys know, right? Dogs, yeah, family dogs. So you got a poodle, you got a cocker spaniel, you can get a cockapoo, these super cute little dogs, right? So are these different species? What do you guys think, dogs? No. They're not, right? So all dogs are the same species. In fact, all dogs are the same subspecies, so even more specific. They're all the same. So it doesn't matter if you have a German Shepherd or a teacup poodle or whatever, right? They're all the same. Canis lupus familiaris. In fact, Canis lupus, do you guys know what Canis lupus is? The species? Wolf. Yeah, so they're all domesticated wolves. It is really weird to think that that came from a wolf, right? But it did. So all of your dogs are the same species, even though they look very different from one to another in some instances. Okay, so appearances can be deceiving in that way. What about these two? These birds look really similar, right? If you were just out doing a bird survey with some binoculars and you saw these two, you might think they're the same, right? Especially from a distance. If you look a little bit more closely at photos of these two birds, they're more different than they appear at first glance, but this is an African fish eagle, and this is what? You guys know? Bald eagle, yeah, there, right? So these two are different species. They're in the same genus, but they're separated by continents, right? So these guys only occur in Africa. These are North American. They don't hybridize. They never come into contact with one another, first of all, okay? But they look almost exactly the same. So you guys get the point that if you just look at something, it's hard to tell sometimes whether it's the same species or different species. So let's talk about where these guys come from. The term you guys need to know is speciation. Have you heard that word before? Some of you are nodding, yes, you have. So speciation is just a process by which two new species are formed from one original species. So when you think about diversity or diversification through the processes of evolution over time, you're always thinking about branching. okay? So nothing just like appears out of nowhere. Everything comes from a common ancestor. If you trace it all the way back, you get to LUCA, L-U-C-A. It's an acronym for the last universal common ancestor. You guys heard that term before? Do we know what it is or what it was? Not really, right? There's a lot of people working on that question, but we don't have a specific answer to what was that first organism, but likely prokaryote, right? Unicellular, something similar to an archaea or bacteria like you would see today, but nothing that exists now. But ultimately, everything comes from that same origin. So when you get a new species, it has to come from somewhere, and it's usually a branch on the tree of life, okay? So when we talk about speciation, we're looking at the idea that two populations arise from one population. They evolve, they split, okay? So we'll talk about some ways that that can happen, whether it's geographic separation or other mechanisms, but they separate from one another, and then because of different environmental pressures, they evolve on different trajectories or different pathways until they're so different that they no longer interbreed, and then you have two species. Yes, under the biological species concept. So far, so good? All right, another important thing to keep in mind, same idea with the whole origin and splitting off of the tree thing. Speciation events are thought of as splitting events. So formation of more than one new species at the same time is not very likely, and is usually viewed as two single events occurring closely in time. Okay, so what that means, we can use our elephant phylogeny here to sort of think about what that means. So you've got Paleomastodon, the ancestral elephant, okay? When you see these branches coming off of this tree here, they're not like one origin with 3 or 4 branches coming off at the same time, right? You see every little bit of sort of distance on this phylogenetic tree indicates the passage of time. Does that make sense? So you don't see Stegodon and Ananthus and what is this, Elephas, all branching off at the same point, but rather you have individual sort of branching events. Now, if you look right here, these groups diverge from one another pretty closely in time. You guys can sort of see that, right? So I'd have to actually look it up to give you specific dates. But it looks pretty close compared to something like, oh, I don't know, when this lineage split off and then the Ananthus lineage split off later. You guys see the point? So it's not like poof, diversification in most cases. So speciation events are usually single branches, single splitting events. Interesting note, this is a drawing from Darwin's book on the origin of species, and it's the only illustration in the whole book. And it's like the first phylogenetic tree that was ever drawn. And it was really him just thinking, like hypothesizing, this might happen this way, this way, this way. So that's kind of cool. It's just a picture from your book, but it bears mentioning. All right, so a little bit of terminology about speciation and how it happens. We're going to talk about allopatry or allopatric speciation, and then a couple slides later, we're going to get into sympatry or sympatric speciation. Okay, so the only difference between these two types of speciation is where it happens. All right, so when we look at allopatric, allo, the root word allo means other. Okay, so just commit that to memory, because the etymology of words, where these terms come from, will often help you, especially in biology and other sciences, because we use the same root words to build other scientific words, right? So if you can start to commit those to memory, it's really helpful. So you guys will notice that I do that a lot. I'll tell you where this word comes from, what the roots of that word mean, and that can sort of help you build your science vocabulary, okay? So allo means other, and patric means homeland. You can think about things like patriotic, right? Same root, okay? So think about homeland, other homeland, that's allopatry. So what do you think sympatry might mean? Same homeland, exactly. So allopatric speciation occurs because a parent population, or that single population from which two new populations arise, are separated geographically. They go to two new homelands, okay, other homeland. So speciation occurs after a separation of that parent population, and then again, because of those different environmental conditions, in those two new homelands, if you will, they evolve differently. They adapt to their new environment in different ways because they have different environmental pressures. This can happen in a couple of different, well, lots of different ways, but the two I want to sort of focus on here at first are dispersal and vicariance. Okay, so just more vocabulary for you. Dispersal means some individuals from the population get up and move. They just go, okay? Maybe there's too much competition, and so they're driven to look for other places where there are resources. Maybe it's a bad season for food, so there's not enough to support everybody. And so it's, yeah, it's competition, but it's also environmental conditions driving that competition, right? And so they disperse. And disperse just means to spread out, right? So a dispersal event is when a few members of a population move somewhere else and establish a new homeland, okay? And then those two groups are geographically separated. Like in the case of spotted owls, so this is the range map for the northern spotted owl. This is the range map here in yellow for the Mexican spotted owl. They're separated geographically. Okay, so I don't know the detailed history of the genus that contains the spotted owl, but I can make some pretty good conjectures here, right? So somebody, let's assume that the Mexican spotted owl population is the parent population. Some group of individual spotted owls probably got up and left. Right? And when they found a place that was suitable, a new population grew, right? But these two populations are separated by that distance. What is here? Do you guys know? Geographically or geologically? Not the Rockies, they're a little bit further over. I thought it was the Rockies at first too, but then I was looking at maps. This is smaller. Say again? That's around the same area, probably same artifact, same geological artifact, but the Sierra Nevada mountains are right here. So I think that's probably what keeps them separated. Nonetheless, there are two populations that came from the same parent population, dispersed and started a new population. But now they're separate, they don't intermix. They can't get across those mountains, or they don't anymore. So they're two separate species, which kind of leads us right into vicariance. And vicariance is a separation but a naturally occurring physical or geological formation. So you could also make the case that if this spotted owl population existed before the Sierra Nevadas, that maybe that's what separated them. Do you guys see the difference between the two, dispersal versus vicariance? So vicariance can be a split of a parent population by building a highway through where a population lives, through the range of an organism. It could be a volcano erupts and a lava flow separates the two populations. You guys get what I'm saying? So it's kind of like voluntary is dispersal and vicariance is involuntary, by the geological changes that happen. So those are just two different ways. Now, the further the distance separating the two groups that have split, the more likely speciation is to occur. Why do you think that is? Distance. Yeah, the further apart you are, the more likely your environmental conditions are somewhat different, right? Different plants grow, different climate circumstances, that sort of thing. So that's allopatry. Underneath sort of the heading of speciation and allopatry comes adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is right in between allopatry and sympatry, because we're getting there next, because it's kind of both. Let me think how I want to do this. Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about adaptive radiation, then we'll get to sympatry, because you guys already know that sympatry means same homeland. Yes? All right, so just keep that in mind. So adaptive radiation happens when a lot of different species, many adaptations arise from a single point, resulting in multiple speciation events. Now again, remember, speciation are single splits, okay? So it doesn't mean they all happen at once, but adaptive radiation would be when a whole lot of different adaptations are occurring simultaneously, so you get really close speciation events happen, okay? Typical example of adaptive radiation would be Galapagos finches, right? One finch or one group of finches from the mainland goes out to the Galapagos. There are no finches there, you guys. So there's all this new ecological territory to be conquered. There are all these ecological niches to fill. And so if you are well adapted for a certain food source or habitat type or climate within that sort of, let's call it microclimate, within that archipelago or island group, then you sort of move into that niche and specialize. So speciation is happening a lot because of different adaptations to different niches that are available. Another good example of this is the Hawaiian honeycreeper, this single genus called Cyanurpes, and this is a selection of some of the species in the genus, but it's not all of them. There's a lot of different honeycreepers in Hawaii, and remember, Hawaii is a pretty young formation, volcanic island chain, it's not that old. So the same thing happened with these birds as what happened with the Galapagos finches, but scientists were curious, where did they all come from? Okay, they're all well adapted to their own niches. Some of them eat bugs, some of them eat nectar. They have different beak shapes. Really similar story, right, to the Galapagos finches. So this is a paper. It was published in 2011, so it's almost a decade old now. But it's the science behind figuring out who was the founder. So who was that species that went to the Hawaiian Islands and then radiated into all the species of Cyanurpes that we see now. Turns out it was a finch. It's always the finches, right? But if you're interested in sort of the work that they did, this is a Smithsonian article. So it's not like a scientific paper. It's not hard to read. It's just a popular science article on how they figured that out using genetics. So that's kind of cool. So adaptive radiation, the reason that I say that it's kind of in between allopatry and sympatry is because first you need a dispersal event, right? So that's an allopatric component. One founder finch leaves the mainland and lands in Hawaii. But then once you're there, you have that speciation as a result of filling those new ecological niches that are available, which is speciation in the same place, right? So sympatry. Does that make sense? Kind of, you could make the argument for either side, allopatry versus sympatry. There are other examples of sympatric speciation that are less, you can't really argue it. It actually happens in the same place. So there's no physical separation between the two populations that arise from the parent population, and yet it occurs anyway. So this one's a little bit more difficult to sort of figure out the underpinnings, right? Figure out the causes that are driving this phenomenon. So I'm going to have you guys rewind back to Bio 1 again. I told you that would happen with some frequency, right? And remember ploidy. What is ploidy level? You guys know that term? What are your cells? How many sets of chromosomes do you have? Some of y'all are two? Yeah, it's two. So you are, because you have two sets of chromosomes, you are considered what? Diploid. What if you are, you only have one set of chromosomes? What's that? Haploid. What if you had three? Can you get? Anybody know? With an example of polyploidy, you could call it triploid, right? If you have four, you're going tetraploid. You can go hexaploid or octaploid. It's all like crazy, okay? So that's what we're sort of talking about here. The term aneuploidy means not or absence of, right? That's a or and then eu means true, right? Like eukaryote, true nucleus. You guys remember that? So this means does not have the correct ploidy level, aneuploid. So that happens because frequently because of non-disjunction errors. Do you guys remember that from meiosis? What's non-disjunction? Anybody remember? Any like meiosis nerds in the group? Like read about it? They don't separate correctly. Yeah, so during meiosis, remember you have to separate homologous pairs and then you have to separate sister chromatids. If they fail to separate correctly, you end up with errors of non-disjunction, which means they just didn't come apart. So if you have gametes that are forming through meiosis, you guys with me, right? Sex cells, sperm and egg, they're forming through meiosis. You have non-disjunction, so you end up with two gametes, but your chromatids don't separate correctly, or your homologous pairs don't separate correctly, so you end up with too many in one cell and not enough in the other. Does that ring a bell? Kind of? Okay. So non-disjunction errors lead to gametes that have the incorrect number of chromosomes, which is aneuploidy. Okay? And it happens. That's why you learned about it in biology 1107. So when this happens, you have gametes that are capable of, they're still capable of participating in fertilization events. But when they do actually lead to the formation of an offspring, that offspring may or may not be, first of all, viable, because, especially in animals, we do not respond well to having the wrong number of chromosomes, right? Usually, if you have non-disjunction in human gametes that participate in fertilization, that's a non-viable offspring. There are exceptions to that, a few, but not very many. So usually animals don't respond very well to having too many or too few genes. We just are fragile and sensitive creatures. But plants, they love it. They actually do really well with polyploidy and non-disjunction and all kinds of weird stuff going on, which is where we get to these examples of sympatric speciation. I'm getting to a point. Autopolyploidy and allopolyploidy. And I don't really expect you guys to give me a detailed lecture on either one of these concepts, but I do want you to understand a little bit behind how it works. Because like I said, sympatric speciation is a little bit more complex. There's still a lot we don't understand necessarily about how this happens, especially in animals. So to give you guys a video to watch about that too, talking a little bit about some animal examples of sympatry. But in this case, we're mostly talking about plants. So if polyploidy means you have extra chromosomes, you could be triploid, you could be tetraploid. Doesn't matter how many extra sets, you just have extra. That's the general term, polyploid. Okay? Autopolyploidy means you have a genome, an organism with a genome that contains extra chromosomes, and those extra chromosomes came from the same organism. Because we're often talking about plants, they can frequently self-fertilize. Okay, so you don't see that as often in animals, but it's not uncommon in plants. All right, so you can sort of imagine, or we can look at this external link together. I've got a link to BioNinja for both of these. It's actually pretty helpful. This thing will do what I want it to do here. Hang on a second. Let's look at this example together. This is going to be helpful on your study guide. Have you guys been looking at the study guides? Every chapter has one. So there's a chapter 18 study guide up, and one of those bullet points for key concepts asks you to be able to describe the events that lead to this type of thing in autopolyploidy or allopolyploidy. You don't, again, have to give me a detailed account of the step-by-step, but I just want you to understand that it has to do with extra chromosomes and reproductive events, okay? So for autopolyploidy, that's actually a pretty good graphic too. Allopatric versus sympatric, that's a nice visual. I like that. But you gotta scroll down a little bit further to see how autopolyploidy happens. Yeah, so you have the parent cell here, it's a diploid cell, undergoing meiosis, but there's no reduction, right? So you see there's still two chromosomes of each. There's a pair of each still. So two of each. They don't reduce. This thing self-fertilizes, like in a plant that can pollinate itself. And then you end up with a zygote, which is the first cell that results from fertilization, right? Again, pulling you back from some terminology from Bio 1. And now your new individual here has got twice the number of chromosomes. So you've gone from a diploid individual to a tetraploid individual because of a single error during meiosis in this individual that then pollinates itself. You guys follow what's going on here? So you get extra chromosomes in the next generation, but that's because it came from the same individual, same organism. Yes? Okay, I see some tentative nodding and no this, so that's good. That's a good sign. All right, that's autopolyploidy. Of course, there's a more complicated explanation for allopolyploidy. And there's a BioNinja to show you that too. Yikes. So in order for allopolyploidy, what does allo mean? Just like allopatric? Allo means other, remember. So that might help. Auto meaning self, like automatic. Yes. Autotroph, yeah, maybe. And allo means other. So allopolyploidy means it's polyploid, but it came from another. So maybe that helps. I don't know. But this has to happen in 2 rounds of hybrid reproduction, basically. So you end up with 2 different species. Allopolyploidy, meaning that your extra chromosomes come from another species. So it's a hybridization event. Okay, 2 different species. And what happens is non-disjunction error in species A leads to extra chromosomes here, but the other species has normal gametes. So in the first hybrid, the chromosomes are unpaired. So it's not going to do well if it doesn't go to the next step, where it actually has another second fertilization event with the same parent species, which then ends up with everybody paired together. Does this or does this not seem like really unlikely to happen? It seems crazy, right? It seems ridiculous. And yet, many of our most important crops that we rely on for food happen because of allopolyploidy. So it's actually pretty frequent in plants. Plants do some weird stuff, you guys. Anybody like plants? One? Yeah. There's always 1 or 2 in the group. Animals are very charismatic. Everybody likes animals, but plants, I think, get a kind of a bum rap. People think they're boring, but I'll tell you what, they're not. We're going to talk about some cool stuff that plants do later. I like animals too, but I'm a biologist, so what are you going to do? All right, so what I want you guys to know, again, is just the difference between these 2 processes. And although the study guide says the events leading up to, I don't need you to give me the BioNinja breakdown. I just need you to tell me that it has to do with non-disjunction and hybridization and stuff like that. So just sort of a general knowledge of how this occurs. But what you end up with, ultimately, the offspring of either one of these phenomena lead you to a new organism that has a different number of chromosomes, may or may not be able to reproduce with the parent populations. So you've got speciation happening in place. So sympatry. You guys with me? Anybody lost in the wilderness? Okay, let me know. You don't have to say anything in class, but hit me up later, because I don't want you to feel like you just got, run over by sympatric speciation. All right, some examples of polyploids. Did somebody say something on the Zoom? Okay, thought I heard something, sorry. Some examples: wheat, cotton, tobacco, corn, sometimes, let's see, watermelons, especially seedless ones. Right, different species of plants, lots of them are used because another cool thing that happens, this is not in the slides, but I believe it's on your study guide, is a phenomenon called gene dosage. So let's say you are a polyploid plant, you have extra chromosomes, you have extra genes. What do genes do on the sort of cellular level? They're making something. What are they making? Or they're coding for the production of proteins, right? So the idea behind this sort of hybrid vigor or strengthening of these polyploid individuals is that they have extra sets of genes that are pumping out extra proteins that in some cases allow these organisms to do things more efficiently, like store sugar. Why is that helpful? Think about corn. You guys know where corn comes from originally? Do you know what family corn belongs in? It's a kind of grass. Do you guys know that? But it doesn't look much like grass. If you look at like a field of corn, right? It's got these big yellow ears. What part of the plant are we eating? When you eat an ear of corn, what is that? Do you guys know? Seeds. In those little yellow kernels is a whole bunch of sugar that plant has been storing up to feed its embryos, right? Which are also in those corn kernels. Every single kernel is a baby, basically a baby corn plant. Okay? So the ability to store all that extra sugar makes those kernels big and juicy and what? Delicious, right? Full of calories, full of nutrition, and fun to eat. So we breed them for those traits. We select for those traits. Does that make sense? So this plant, this corn plant, is better at doing that because it has extra chromosomes that produce more of a protein that lead it to be able to store more sugar, and then we love it. Does that make sense? So gene dosage is just this idea that sometimes if you have extra genes in your plant, you're making more of a product that is beneficial to you. You can also get increased drought resistance, increased pest resistance, disease resistance, climate stability, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the ability to withstand changes in the climate. Resistance, I guess, is the word. Flexibility, maybe. things like that. So that's sympatric speciation. That's a long story. You guys doing all right? Cool. Let's see. In the interest of time, I'm going to allow you guys to watch this on your own, but I want you to watch it, okay? Because you will see at least bonus questions on your exam about the topic in this video. This is just a SciShow. You guys ever watch SciShow? Yeah, some of you? Nobody? Anyway, it's like 4 minutes long, so it's not a huge chunk of your life. He's talking about a phenomenon in apple maggot flies for the first 2.5 minutes, okay? An example of sympatric speciation in animals, which is weird, okay? It's different than plants, doesn't happen as often, and it is more confusing for scientists, and he'll talk about why. And then there's another example of cichlid fish that also have undergone sympatry in the same lake. So it's a really neat little quick explanation video about this story, and then even cooler, the reason I want to focus on the apple maggot flies more than the fish is that recently, within the last year or two, I can't remember the publication date, but if you click on this link, it'll take you to a Science Daily article, which is, again, if you're not familiar with Science Daily, it's like a popular science reporting website, but they always link to the original source. So it's basically like editors who go out there and look at all the newest publications and then post the cool stuff, sort of a synopsis of it. So it's a really good place to find research that's easy to read. And then if you want to go further, you can find the original article and then read that. So you don't have to like read the lit to get to the point. So anyway, there's a Science Daily article, which is just a summary of a paper that explains what happened. So the video will tell you the story, but then he'll say, we don't know why. But then the Science Daily article will explain why. Okay, so take a look at this when you have some time, just so we don't get too bogged down in talking about super interesting stuff. This is why we get behind, because there's so much cool stuff to talk about. So take a look at that. All right, 2 more slides in this chapter, and then we'll do our Kahoot. So get ready for that, okay? This is mostly terminology, once again. Okay, so this stuff, these are just ways that biological species concept is in action. Okay, so ways that populations can be split from one another, or separated from one another, or what we call reproductively isolated from one another. Okay, so remember, if you are a biological species, then you must be able to interbreed with others of your same species in order to be the same thing, right? So that's the definition that we're using. So if you're separated, how are you separated? And there are 2 sort of subdivisions of these types of isolation, pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. What does that mean, do you think? What's the zygote?
The fertile offspring,
Yeah.
fertilized egg.
Yeah, the very first cell, right? Let's say you have 2 haploid gametes and they fuse, you end up with a diploid cell that then divides to become the organism, yes? So that first cell, that's your zygote. So pre-zygotic barriers are those that are in place that keeps a zygote from forming at all. Pre-zygotic, before the zygote, okay? So we'll talk about timing and habitat and behavior and gametic barriers. Those are all things that keep zygotes from forming. And then what do you think post-zygotic barriers mean then? What does post mean? After. Yeah, so this is a zygote forms, but after that, there's some barrier that keeps this offspring from either being viable, being fertile, or persisting. Okay, so those are the 2 sort of subdivisions. So pre-zygotic barriers, again, this is terminology. Temporal, you guys know that term, temporal? It just means time. It has to do with timing. So temporal isolation would be that species mate at different times of the day or different times of the year. Okay, different seasons, nocturnal versus diurnal, things like that. The timing is just wrong, right? So if you've got a nocturnal species and a diurnal species, do they come in contact with one another to mate, do you think? No, because one's awake at night and one's awake in the day. It's as easy as that. It's just that the timing is off. That's what temporal isolation is. Habitat isolation, literally a physical separation of their habitat. Their ranges do not overlap. So African fish eagle, American bald eagle, habitat isolation, absolutely, right? Behavioral isolation. This one's really interesting because I think that animal mating rituals are interesting, right? They do weird things. Some of them fight, some of them dance, some of them jump on each other's heads. I'm not even kidding. Like bluebirds do that. The male bluebird and the female bluebird and like jump on her head a few times. It makes me think of like kids on the playground in elementary school where like one boy likes one little girl runs up and like pulls out her hair or something. It's kind of that sort of antagonism. Anyway, lots of different mating rituals. So if you just behave differently and your head jumping doesn't work on another species that likes, oh, I don't know, a song perhaps, that's behavioral isolation. Whatever you're doing to attract a mate doesn't work on that other species. Does that make sense? Okay. And then you've got gametic barriers where your gametes are prevented from meeting physically, meaning that reproductive structures are incompatible. You don't fit. Okay, a good example of this is in certain types of snails, where their shells spiral in the same direction. So when they come up to each other, say like the tips of my fingers are their heads, right? They come up this way, because their shells are patterned in the same direction, they don't fit together. They have to be patterned in the opposite direction in order to sort of line up. They can't mate even if they wanted to. So that's just physical separation. The reproductive structures completely incompatible. That's gametic barriers. You can't even get gamete together. Make sense? So just terminology, guys, but make sure you're familiar with it and can recognize it if you saw it in the question. Same thing for our post-zygotic barriers. Hybrid inviability. If something is not viable, inviable means not viable. That means they do not survive the embryonic stage. Maybe the zygote forms, but the chromosome number is all wrong, so when things start trying to divide it, it doesn't work. Okay? Or maybe you're an animal, so too many genes means bad things, or not enough genes means bad things, and it just dies. It's inviable. Then you get hybrid sterility. So we've talked about both of these already. Sterility just means non-reproductive, right? Not fertile. Infertile, unfertile. I don't know why I can't think of the word. Not producing fertile offspring. That makes better sense. Offspring are sterile, like most mules. And then you've got hybrid breakdown, which is less extreme than either of the first two options, either inviability or sterility. Hybrid breakdown just means that there are fertile offspring, but there aren't that many of them, so there's a major fitness advantage to not being a hybrid. I think a mule is probably a good example of that, right? There are a few mules here and there that have had baby mules, 60 over 500 years or so, but not enough to produce a new species. So that's hybrid breakdown. Okay, just better not to hybridize because it doesn't work well in the long term. Questions about any of these definitions? Okay. All right, the last thing we'll talk about is sort of the ways that the hybrid zone can exist in species. Remember that evolution is ongoing, right? These changes are happening all of the time. Changes in populations are happening all the time. And sort of whether or not that leads to speciation depends. It depends on a couple of different things: environmental factors, hybrid viability, right? How that sort of works out. So these three are sort of like three different outcomes of what can happen when species start to split. So if you have, this is an example where you've got a single origin, you've got two populations splitting off, and you've got initially still some hybridization. So think about if you have a population that is just starting to separate from one another, okay? Especially in sympatry, right? So you're still in the same place, you can still interact with one another, but you're sort of evolving down two different trajectories. The apple maggot flies are a good example, so watch that video. You see that speciation occurring, and in the beginning, this blue represents the hybrid zone, okay? This is where crosses are still happening, but because the hybrids are less fit than either of the two new species, you get fewer and fewer and fewer over time. So the speciation event is reinforced, okay? That's reinforcement. So this would lead to traditional speciation in the sense that we think of it. Fusion is kind of in the middle. So it's like it starts to happen and you have hybrids in the beginning and then you get fewer and fewer, but then for some reason, those reproductive barriers weaken. Maybe it's hybrid breakdown, right? And then you start to see, hybrid vigor. They're doing fine. So they start to come back together. So speciation never occurs. You have a little bit of a separation, but then things change and they go back to the same species. So that can happen too, because this is all dynamic, right? It's always changing. And then stability means you have all three, species A, species B, and hybrids. Hybrids are equally fit, so they persist, maybe as a new subspecies or a cross, as we call it a hybrid cross. So those are just things that can happen. Basically, it means that there are different outcomes with speciation events. Okay, so that's, again, just some terminology. Really, I'm mostly just concerned that you know that there are different end results in these types of splitting events. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, that's the end of chapter 18. That's a long chapter, right? How many slides is that? 33?
I had a question.
Yeah, we're building a foundation. How do you guys feel? Still quiet. Ready for a Kahoot?
I had a question.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I asked earlier in the chat if temperature would cause certain animals to like go north or south. So for instance, we have foxes that live here, but we also have like foxes that live in the north that are more inclined to temperature, like of cold temperature. What would that be called? Like what category would that fit under for temperature?
If you have, okay, sorry, I was also trying to read the chat because there were 26 chats. So I can't, before I get to your question, I am not manning the chat. So
Okay.
if you guys are chatting to each other and trying to get me, just holler out like you did.
Okay.
Because I didn't even, there were 26 chats when you said, I put my question in the chat. So your question again was about foxes that live here versus foxes that have moved north, or?
Yeah, well, like we were talking about how like there's like different reasons for separation of species.
Yeah.
And like I just didn't know if temperature would be like a reason to separate, even though there's relatively the same species.
Sure, I
what,
think so.
And what that would be called, like what category that would be under.
So her question, you guys, is if you had, so for example, a species of foxes or population of foxes, and some moved with a temperature gradient, right? Like they maybe preferred cooler temperatures, so they moved northward. And where would that fall under reproductive isolation? Or is there, do you mean, is there a special term for that?
I just didn't know if there was like a special term versus like, you know, how like geological, like a highway being built, or if it was their choice to leave or whatever it was. I just didn't know if there's like a more specific like.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's actually a term for that. I can imagine a scenario where that would be the case, right? But that would seem to me like more of an adaptation. Wouldn't you guys think? Like a certain sort of subset of the population might be better suited to live in a warmer or cooler climate, like maybe has thicker fur or more fat or something like that. And so they would be the population that would be more inclined to move northward if there were, say, a food shortage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I don't know that there's actually like a term. There's definitely not one in the PowerPoint for that.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was just wondering. I just didn't know if there was, but yeah.
I don't know. It could be behavioral isolation, but I would say it would be more like environmental, right? Or something along those lines. But a good example.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's all.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. You guys ready to Kahoot? Okay, all you have to do if you're on a phone is just put in the join code, right? You guys know how to do this?
Would you be able to share the screen of the Kahoot?
Let me see if I can do that. Hang on 1 second. I'm going to join my own Zoom and see if this works. Now I can see myself. Okay. My sound is off on this one. Can you guys still hear me on Zoom?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, I
All
can.
right. I'm going to see if I can share my screen and if it works.
Yeah, it works.
So far, so good. Let's see if everybody here and at home can see and hear. If we pulled this off, I'm going to be impressed. Those of you on Zoom, if you have your videos on and you don't wish to be seen, the classroom can see you. So you're welcome to leave it on if you're fine. I just want to let you know that we can all see folks at home. All right, you guys ready? I think it's working. So you can go ahead and put in your game pin either at kahoot.it if you're on your computer or on the Kahoot app. So you just enter that code, and then, oh, by the way, when you put in your name, everyone's gonna be able to see it. So just keep that in mind. Can't tell where the sound is coming from. It's there now, it's not. The music is half the time on this thing. Oh, sorry, no music. All right, you guys on Zoom, can you still hear me? Okay. Just making sure. All right, is everybody in that wants to be in? Can I go ahead and start it? I think my start button is hidden by. Okay, changes in the allele frequency in the gene pool of a population over time due to a variety of influential factors. That sounds familiar. So if you've not played Kahoot before, you just pick the color of the answer that matches your choice. Good, so most of you guys picked up on that. I changed the words a little bit of the definition because Kahoot limits character number, kind of like Twitter. But you figured it out anyway. It means the same thing. Good. All right, they're going to get harder. That one is a softball. Which early evolutionary thinker proposed the hypothesis known as inheritance of acquired characteristics? And the giraffes are a hint. Was it old Chuck D, Charles Darwin? Was it Leclerc? Was it Lamarck? Or was it Dozansky? Yeah, Lamarckian evolution, right? That was the guy who first proposed the mechanism for changing species over time. So he was a little bit off, but it was a good idea nonetheless. And he was significant because he was publishing on the topic. All right, here's another little softball for you, true or false. Since all vertebrates share a common ancestor, the patterning of their limb bones is considered a homologous trait. True or false? Oh, good. Most of you got true. That's correct. What if the characteristic was really similar, but not because of a shared common ancestor, but because of shared environmental pressures? What would the term for that be? Say again? I still can't hear you. Oh, vestigial. That's different. I'm looking for kind of the opposite of homologous. Analogous. Yeah. Good. Those are all very closely related terms. So, yeah, definitely related. All right. What kind of evolution occurs when two distantly related organisms evolve a similar phenotype? It might lead to an analogous structure, but what's the name for that type of evolution? Wings and bats, wings and birds, wings and insects are a good example, which is why I put that weird wing picture on here to jog the memory. Two distantly related organisms evolve a similar phenotype. Convergent evolution, right? Divergent means one lineage goes in two different directions. Convergent means you see a convergence of features, not because of relatedness, but because of shared pressures. All right, natural selection depends on three factors. Which of the following is not one of those factors? And these guys are up here to remind you that they together came up with those three factors. Darwin and Wallace, in case you don't know. Genetic inheritance, competition for resources, sexual reproduction, or variation within populations. One of these does not belong on the list. I set the timer a little longer on this one to give you time to think if you need it. Better with the music. I gotta figure that part out next time. I told you with the 3 different devices, it's hard. Ooh, that's an even split. That's a good question. That's like a good test question, huh? So the correct answer to the question, which one did not belong, is sexual reproduction. Why? Well, it's not on the list, right? There's the slide that has genes, competition, and variation, and those are the 3 factors, sort of simplified down to single terms. Why isn't sexual reproduction one of those factors that you must have in place? So you must have inheritable traits, right? You must have competition. More offspring are produced than can survive. And you must have variation in order for any one of those to have an advantage. So why doesn't this matter? Do you see natural selection happening in asexual populations? Sure. We watched a video. What did we watch happen? Bacterial evolution, right? Prokaryotes, binary fission, and yet we saw selection in action with the antibiotic concentrations increasing, right? So yes, it's important, and yes, it's applicable. Natural selection is applicable to sexually reproducing populations, but it's also applicable to asexually reproducing populations. Yes? That's a big question. Pat myself on the back on that one. All right. When extra chromosomes are acquired in the genome through a 2-generation process of hybridization, it is both, this is a hard one, sympatric and autopolyploidy, or allopatric and auto, or allopatric and allopolyploidy, or sympatric and auto. I'm going to let you guys think. There's kind of a hint in the image. What is that a picture of? Do you guys know? Wheat. Yeah, pretty good. More people got it than I would have guessed. So it's sympatric, right, because it's a polyploidy thing, and it's allo because it's 2 rounds of hybrid crosses that get you to allopolyploidy. Good. That's an idea of the complexity of a question that you would see on the exam. So this one, again, I don't want you guys to spend hours of time reading about autopolyploidy and allopolyploidy because you don't really need to know more than like this, okay? So I looked at the study guide and the question on the study guide makes it look harder than what I really expect from you. All right, true or false? All of your family dogs, whether pit bull or chihuahua, are descended from Canis lupus the wolf. True or false? We just talked about this. Yeah, good. Next time you go home and play with your dog, think about that. All right, male eastern meadowlarks. If you don't know what that is, there's a picture coming up here in a second. Sing a different song to attract females than male western. You guys can read, I cannot. They sing a different song to attract females than male western meadowlarks. What type of isolation is this? The music came down. That's weird. I didn't do anything. Good. Yeah, see, this is just terminology. You guys have already got that down. behavioral isolation. One meadow, they look also, that picture is an eastern, but a western looks almost exactly the same. If you were looking at them in your hands, it'd be hard to tell the difference between an eastern and a western meadowlark, but their songs are different. And even where they co-occur, so their ranges do overlap, but they very rarely hybridize, which is kind of cool to think about. It's like they just don't like that song. All right. I think this is the last one. When a single group of organisms splits into two groups that evolve independently until they no longer interbreed, that is speciation, adaptation, weird, or genetics. You probably have to pick the best answer on this one, right? Because maybe more than one you can make a case. Just looking for speciation. So we went from softballs to hard questions and then back down again. Good. What do you guys think? Do you like Kahoots? It's a good way to how do I get out of here? Get an idea of the types of questions that you might see on an exam. All right. Folks in Zoom, I'm going to stop sharing. Did that work well?
Yeah, I did.
No? Great. All right, we've got just a couple of minutes. Let me leave my own meeting. Okay, still working. Let's just preview the next chapter. Since we have a couple of minutes, I'm not going to go long. I just want to sort of show you where we're headed because population genetics is not different than evolution. And in fact, what I want to show you is kind of how they're the same, kind of what we're going to do in the next chapter. Oh, another thing I'm going to do, so once we get into this chapter, we're going to talk about actual ways to measure changes in allele frequencies in populations. So it is a continuation, you guys, of evolution, right? But it's just a way that population geneticists or scientists who study evolution on the population level can measure those things. So one of the first sort of concepts that we're going to talk about is Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Has anybody heard of Hardy-Weinberg before? Some nods, but it's only a few, right? There's a little bit of math involved with Hardy-Weinberg equations, and we're going to do some of it. This is the equation itself. It just looks like algebra, right? Everybody had algebra, high school or otherwise. So this is pretty simple algebra that we'll look at together on Wednesday, and we'll do some problems. But what I'm going to do in the meantime is post a couple of videos. There's a pretty good crash course video. You guys ever watch Crash Course? You know, Hank Green, the guy talks really fast and covers things in pretty well. A pretty good way. There's a good one on Hardy-Weinberg that I'll post for you. And then there's a couple of videos that I made for this class multiple semesters ago. I'll link to those as well. So I'll put up some videos in the chapter 19 chapter module on D2L. So you can take a look at those ahead of time if you have a chance. And it might make it easier as we start talking about how to do those math problems and work out population genetics using that equation. And we'll do a couple of examples in class. This is what I wanted to show you. We're going to talk about those mechanisms in evolution. So remember in that definition, that you're talking about changes in allele frequencies, blah, 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 because of natural selection and other mechanisms, right? These are the mechanisms. Mutation, we've talked about. We're going to hit on drift, gene flow, and sexual selection and non-random mating. So we're going to actually talk about those other mechanisms because all we've talked about so far is natural selection and a little bit about mutation. So that's what we'll spend some time on in the second part of this chapter. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. Then a movie about rock pocket mice, which is pretty cool too. So that's where we're headed. We're a couple minutes early, but because you guys have to find your way to the ballroom and I have to figure out how to set up the technology in the ballroom, we'll end a couple minutes early. So if you have class today, I'll see you over in the student center. We'll start at about 12:30. So if you have time, grab a snack at the cafe or something, and I'll make you guys over. If you have Wednesday lab, you are free to go, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday. If you're web-based, your labsters, one was due last night and your second one's open on evolution, so make sure you're keeping up with that. But I put an announcement out on D2L for you guys. So, good. All right, I'm gonna end this. Bye.